Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Polland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones.
This week on Red, White, and Blue redistricting. Is it finally over? What happened and why? And when does it mean to the average voter? First, a little history. The Texas legislature is required to redistrict every 10 years. Democratic activists, allied groups, and the Obama administration challenged the lines as a violation of the Federal Voting Rights Act in federal courts both in Texas and in Washington. New maps were released around March 1st, designed by a federal court in Texas, and the Texas primary was moved by that same court from its traditional March date to May 29th. Court challenges continue, and the legislature could revisit redistricting in the next session. All this and more this week with our all-star panel. Joining us tonight are first, Robert Miller, chair of the Locke Lord's Public Law Section and a well-known political blogger. Silvia Garcia, president of the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials and former Harris County Precinct 2 commissioner. And finally, last but not least, Paul Bettencourt, CEO of Bettencourt Tax Advisors and former Harris County Tax Assessor Collector.
Way to go. Nice read. Mr. Miller, you and Silvia Garcia actually were witnesses to when this was heard at the Supreme Court originally. So first you, Mr. Miller, give us a lawyerly profile of the two pieces of litigation that Gary just described and where they are today.
Certainly, David, as you mentioned, the legislative plan that was passed was challenged in a three-judge panel in San Antonio based on constitutional infirmities and that it did not comply with Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which addresses dilution of minority votes. Mm-hmm. There is a second section of the Voting Rights Act, Section 5, which deals with discriminatory effect and intent, and that is handled either by the Department of Justice in Washington or a three-judge panel in Washington, D.C. Separate cases. The San Antonio court recognized early on that they would not be able to address the constitutional and the voting rights challenges in time for the March primaries. They delayed the March primaries, but then they also issued an interim map. So we're dealing with a second map. You had the legislative map. The court has issued an interim map. The first interim map would have greatly favored the Democrats. The Attorney General Abbott appealed that to the Supreme Court. They stayed the map, had oral arguments in early January. Commissioner Garcia and I were there. They ultimately overturned that map and told the court, give more deference to the legislative plan. So now the San Antonio court has issued a second map. It is more favorable to the Republicans, and they've scheduled an election for May 29th.
And are there any shoes that are legal litigation shoes that are likely to drop, that are going to do anything at all as far as challenging when we hold our primaries or what maps we may end up being seen for November of 2012?
Well, it is not over. Whether it's likely to have another shoe is unclear, but the three-judge panel in San Antonio, which has issued the interim map, that map still must be pre-cleared by the Department of Justice. If they do not pre-clear the map, then we cannot hold elections until we have a pre-cleared map.
And we love pre-clearance, don't we, Mr. Bettencourt?
Yes.
And Ms. Garcia, we love pre-clearance.
No, we love pre-clearance, but I'll defer to Silvia.
Well, I think Robert is absolutely correct in his analysis in terms of the procedures here. I mean, there's so many moving pieces, and, you know, I would say that, yeah, another shoe could drop. I mean, people could file an appeal once the San Antonio court, their order is final. The D.C. court, the panel up there could do something differently. I mean, something could happen. But my guess is it probably won't. Right. It probably won't. Because I sense, and Robert and I talked about this in the green room while we were waiting, there seems to be some coordination, whether it's, between the judges in San Antonio and the judges in Washington, D.C. And I just don't think that the San Antonio court would have approved the maps if they didn't get some guidance or some kind of signal, if you will, from the D.C. courts that it was going to be okay.
And if we don't have a final map by the end of next week, by March 30th, then you cannot have a June 26th primary, which is the last possible primary date, which would mean then we wouldn't have primaries in Texas. That if the Department of Justice were to not pre-clear the map or the Washington, D.C. court were to rule in after March 30th, then you're probably looking at a Louisiana-style jungle primary on November 8th.
But that's not our system.
No. And I don't think it's going to happen.
I agree with Silvia and Robert. This is not going to happen. There's too much already a good momentum for the May 29th primary dates. There is some concern, I think, on the congressional map around Austin, Silvia, where there's, and Robert knows this, where there's some of the Democrat plaintiffs are still concerned that they're not getting a fair shake in that Travis County area, but there's very little consternation about it elsewhere in the state. Basically, what the judges did was, we've got 4 new congressional districts, 2 are Republican, 2 are Democrat. Generally, when Solomon rules, that's enough to get the primary going. And I can't imagine that either court would take the position of throwing it into a jungle primary, as Robert said, open primary in November. We're going to have an election on May 29th, and then the maps will change later, and those are called remedial maps. But we'll get into more of that.
We have this term pre-clearance that's been talked about, and I would like for maybe you, Robert Miller, just tell us a little bit about what pre-clearance means, and isn't that the big battle that the Supreme Court is weighing right now in a couple of cases?
The Voting Rights Act was passed in 1965. It covers 9 states and some other jurisdictions. What it says is that any actions, legislative actions in those states that deal with the election process must be pre-cleared or cleared by either the Department of Justice, and they have to be pre-cleared or cleared under Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Republicans have been contending that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional because it infringes on state sovereignty. An example is voter ID. Passed by the legislature, it has been not pre-cleared by the Justice Department, cannot go into effect. A virtually identical bill was passed by the Indiana legislature, signed by the governor. It is in effect because they're not subject to the Voting Rights Act.
Well, and as a state Republican official, or former one, and on the redistricting committee, this was a mistake that the Bush administration re-upped the Voting Rights Act in 2006. You have the problem now is these 9 states have to prove that racism doesn't exist in the 21st century when the law was passed in the mid-20th. And there's no factors opposition to the fact that we need 9 states covered by a separate act. And this was something that, quite frankly, the Republicans shouldn't have voted for because they passed a 25-year extension. So that means unless this law is overturned by the Supreme Court, we're going to be doing this over and over again to the earlier question. Redistricting will never be over.
The law is still needed. The law is still needed.
And I was going to ask you that,
And I disagree that it's unconstitutional. And I know there's a lot of people who would argue with me on that, especially these 2 guys. But the bottom line is that there still is discrimination in the South, in the states where the Voting Rights Act has to be followed. Texas, regrettably, is one of those. And until we fix some things, not only in Texas but in the South, that gives people the right to vote, that gives people the one person, one vote constitutional principle to everyone, where we make sure that there's access to the voting ballot, that there's access to voter registration. When all those things get fixed, well, then maybe we can say, enough, it's done, we can move on. But regrettably, that's not the case.
Isn't there something else we can do with redistricting, Gary and the rest of you, other than have it go to legislatures where we have partisan gridlock as what we experience?
California went through a commission, but you know what? Best I can tell, because our main office for NALEO, which I represent as president, 6,000 Latino elected officials throughout this country, you know, it seems like they're having some of the same hurdles, some of the same issues.
Absolutely.
I'm not sure that solves it. I just think we all ought to gut it up and know that the Constitution says we have to do it after every census. Our state Constitution says we have to, and let it go through.
I mean, quite frankly,
the issues are more complicated than that.
I think Sylvia agreed. The plans were rushed through the legislature. These plans were the congressional plan. People had 1 day to vote on them in this special session. That should be done earlier in the session. There should be more public input. I think that's the right way to play redistricting for both parties in the state of Texas.
But isn't it also true, if we look around the country, and this is for any of you, that redistricting is an inherently political mechanism?
It's the biggest political game in town.
Yeah, whoever's in charge
it's the big one.
Maps.
This is the biggest political fight of all, and it happens every 10 years, and it's been going on since day one.
But shouldn't Silvia be complaining, as of yet she hasn't, about how our redistricting was rigged to defeat minority interests? All of the population growth in this state,
Harris County?
The state of Texas.
I think both did it.
All of our growth has been in Hispanic areas of the state. What representation did you get out of the legislative redistricting?
Latinos were thrown under the bus. not only the state redistricting, but even I would submit in the Harris County redistricting, we're over 50% of the reason why Texas grew and why we got the 4 additional seats. But yet, we only got 1.
Silvia, I have to disagree.
And I think the problem becomes when you start fighting over whether it's voting age population, where it's really people that have voted, whether it's really people that have, gone out and voted. I mean, it gets, you can fight over all the minutia, but the bottom line is we're not assuring the one person, one vote principle
Silvia,
of the Constitution.
You've seen the arguments, and the arguments were that effectively Hispanic Republicans are different than Democratic Republicans, that rural Hispanics are different than urban, and the guy that got thrown under the bus in the first map was Congressman Canseco, who happens to be a Republican, and the court basically completely redistricted him out. So I disagree strongly that Latinos got thrown under the bus. Republicans got thrown under the bus under that first map passed by the court out of San Antonio. And let me go back to another point. The whole concept of the Voting Rights Act that was passed in '65 when my predecessor, the tax office, was taking poll taxes, okay, and you flash forward, 45 years into the future, you just don't have that type of discrimination. It just doesn't exist.
Because you were the tax assessor when I got a notice that my voter registration was suspended.
Yeah, because you didn't respond to the notice.
And I had voted every single time.
Well, because you had a driver's license separate from the.
Before.
I know.
But under state law, did you
read
the Houston Chronicle article on the number of people that probably get purged? And who it impacts the most is Latino voters, minority voters,
since
older
the National
voters.
Voter Registration.
It's still there, Paul.
Okay, time out. Here's the facts. Since the National Voter Registration Act, the NVRA, passed in the mid-1990s, every cycle, 200,000 or so or less people, 150,000, get purged. The reason why is they move. They move, and because of that federal law,
but some of us don't. You just send us a letter telling us you're suspended.
No. Okay, that's old history. Robert Miller needs to tell us about the evidence.
I want to make sure Silvia can still vote, though.
Yeah, she can still vote because she was just on the suspense list and she responded and she got back on.
That's good. Well, the truth is that they do.
That's right.
And I'll give you an example of what Paul's talking about, Silvia. If we don't purge our rolls, I have children who grew up in Houston, registered to vote in Harris County, and voted here while they lived here, even though they went to college. Now one lives in Massachusetts, one lives in California. They've both now been purged from the voter rolls here. But if we didn't have a purging, my kids could vote in California and Texas.
That suspensions hurt people. They really think they can't vote anymore.
Okay, but that's the federal law.
You told us,
right.
Mr. Bettencourt, you told us off air that there were several holes in this redistricting plan that came out of the Texas legislature, that everyone knew that there were holes in it. You also told us that, and there was evidence in the San Antonio hearing, that the Speaker of the House's office was in collusion with Lamar Smith, a congressional Republican, to rig this thing. But it's been reported, Paul.
Okay, well,
there are emails supporting it.
Okay, let's go back to the facts here, David.
Did Strauss do this?
That's right. I agree, so it was in some room. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, now, okay, first off, when the House map was passed, there were 4 or 5 House districts that the people passing the map knew could be contested by the Democratic Party. What the classic is here in Harris County, which is the combination of the Vo-Hochberg districts together. They knew that was going to be challenged when they passed the map. Representative Pena's down on the coast and 3 others. So when that map got passed, they knew that they were stretching. And that's one of the reasons why the state map got passed. And I believe also when the federal court rules out of Washington on Title V issues, those districts have already been changed for and will be mentioned, but they've already been fixed effectively.
Paul, it was overreaching, just as it was overreaching with the mid-decade redistricting done on behalf of Tom DeLay. It was all about protecting Republican majority in the House of Representatives in the United States, and Lamar Smith was the point man for the congressional Republicans to get this fix in.
David forgets that when redistricting happens, Democratic congressmen in Washington, Republican congressmen in Washington are lobbying to make sure they're protected. Isn't that right, Robert?
That's the only time they're in Austin.
Yeah.
Right.
They're individually
Robert,
protected.
You see them every 10 years, Gary.
There you
They
go.
personally go work the floor.
There you go.
So
First of all, you're
you've
wrong.
got a political
David, you're wrong.
process. That's what this is. It's a political process. Now, what the Voting Rights Act does is make it effectively civilly, liable for what is inherently a political process that occurs in 41 other states. Like that. The legislature passes in Illinois, and they passed a plan. They've shot 4 to 5 Republican congressional districts. They're gone. We can't go, call the Justice Department to say, come help us, because they're not under the Voting Rights Act. And that's what's wrong here. We shouldn't be held to a separate standard in the 21st century in Texas when Illinois, which is just as political as Texas is not.
True.
Mr. Miller, you and Ms. Garcia, when you were at the Supreme Court, you were watching those justices. 4 of them are pretty much on record as saying that they are not happy with Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Did you get anything from the arguments about where anybody might be voting on this issue?
I clearly came away with the impression that there are 5 votes on the Supreme Court to overturn Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. Now, whether the Supreme Court does that or not is unclear. The Supreme Court obviously is very cognizant of its position in the country, and I think they're reluctant to appear to be in any way racist or discriminatory. But clearly, the only vote that I had a question about was Justice Kennedy, and he pretty much said that he had significant problems with the Voting Rights Act, Section 5.
He actually came out and said that.
I think all of us were really apprehensive, at least some of us that were there that were Democrats, and were really hoping that they wouldn't even do it with this particular case and use this opportunity to do it. We're really relieved when the Chief Justice basically said something to the effect of, just remember, we're not here to do anything with the Voting Rights Act in total. It's just this particular issue at hand. And a lot of us sort of took a deep breath and thought, well, great, let's move on. And the action of the court really didn't even surprise me. It just surprised me that it was unanimous.
Well, and the commissioner's correct. The Chief Justice did say it's not before this case, and so it does not appear that this case would be the vehicle. But we now have a vehicle which has just arisen, which is the challenge to the voter ID law, which is also being heard by the 3-court panel in District of Columbia. And there is a direct appeal from that D.C. court to the Supreme Court. So if the voter ID law is not pre-cleared under Section 5, I expect that case to go directly to Supreme Court.
And I think that's going to be more problematic for us in terms of Democrats and those of us who believe in the Voting Rights Act.
What about county redistricting? You're not happy with the...
Well, and I think, let's not forget that there still is a pending case before Judge Vanessa Gilmore, and we're set for trial in November. So that case is still going on. We did get interim maps. Those have been agreed to.
Who are the parties? Who are the parties in that suit?
The parties are a coalition of Latino voters and LULAC. And then on the other side, of course, is the county and a group of African-American voters from Commissioner Lee's precinct. That are represented by Craig Washington.
And is Vince Ryan, the county attorney, representing, where is he?
That's always a good question.
Sounds like he's running from this one.
The county has hired Gene Locke's firm, I forget, is it?
Andrews Kurth.
Andrews Kurth. Right. And so the county's hired a team of lawyers. So again, we're set for trial.
There's one thing we do need to talk about. In the last set of political primaries, there's this perception that somehow there's always a constant drumbeat that the Republicans are unfair to people of Hispanic descent. Well, in the last set of primaries we had with people with Hispanic surnames, 1 out of 7 won the Republican primary in Harris County. But on the Democrat side, 2 out of 14 Hispanic surname people in the Democratic primary won. The same ratio. Okay, so part of this is that while this is a big political drumbeat, the actual numbers of what people come out of the primary based on their surnames, which is what the federal government judges by, the exact same ratio won the Republican Party as in the Democratic Party. So, when you look at this, there's a lot of political points being made here. Not all of them are actually based in fact.
Any winners and losers in all this, Gary? This redistricting battle, politically speaking,
besides
who
the
are
lawyers to get hired to work on it? The answer is, well, politically, I think that we could be in a period where things are going to get buffeted and they're going to change. So you're going to have issues with the Justice Department, which may affect lines. We could have a situation. Remember Kevin Brady when he ran for Congress? I think he ran like
4 times.
Right. 4 times,
right.
All those different races. So that could happen. But I wanted to ask Silvia, What is the problem with the Hispanic vote? And I know the Hispanic vote is not monolithic. I actually think the Republicans are doing better and better all the time with Hispanic voters, but why isn't the turnout bigger? What's the problem?
Well, I think you'd be surprised to hear that if you look at how many votes I got when I first got elected and how many votes I got this time, it was about the same. It was about the same. What happened, however, was the anti-Obamacare, anti-Obama, the anti-incumbent kind of thing was bigger nationally.
In 2010,
that you got swept. So the Latino vote
so it didn't grow. It didn't grow.
For me. And I think you have to remember that probably every week there's about 50,000 young Latinos that are eligible to vote. And that's going to continue to grow nationally. And this is nationally.
Good.
Okay? And it's going to continue to grow. We're still a young population. And I don't think people have been conditioned and impressed on enough that they really have to make voting part of their civic engagement.
Sylvia, wouldn't
about.
These folks that Gary is suggesting are not good citizens, I guess, wouldn't they be helped if we had same-day registration? Why don't we have same-day? Why, if the Republicans really want Hispanics to vote, let's have same-day registration.
Well, I think the more we do to have access to the polls and make it easier to vote. I mean, I think the super voting days where you can have the same setup that you do for early voting, even on election day, that you can vote anywhere, is terrific. It's been tested in a couple of counties already in Texas, but Harris County's never chosen to do that. We can. The law is already there.
You could have super centers, what she's talking about.
Because the idea that you can vote anywhere, up to 20 days before.
Right.
But election day, no. You've got to go to your precinct. Just makes no sense.
There's things you can do to modernize the process that it really doesn't affect. It's not like pro one political party or not. Half the vote is now early, and people can vote anywhere in the county at any location, and they can stop by and work, and they'll go to effectively a super center and vote. You could have those.
So why don't we do that on election day?
We should do that on election day. There's no reason not to.
I think it's in Lubbock County that already does that.
Right.
They were
in
the
fact,
first,
I do.
They were
There
the first one to do that.
But
David, I think too. I mean, the more Latinos run, and that people have a candidate that they can identify with and mobilize around is good. I think anything we can do to make sure campaigns are responsive and sensitive about advertising and doing outreach and mobilization efforts out in the Latino pockets is good. I think the other challenge that we have now is that, frankly, we're everywhere. We're not just in Denver Harbor anymore, or just in the East End.
Which means under the Voting Rights Act, you can't draw lines to encompass them. They're going to be like everyone else.
But you could have to get another additional district here, and there were several variations of the congressional maps that showed 2 Hispanic opportunity districts in Harris County.
Okay.
So it depends on how you want to draw.
Just
the map maker and the person with the mouse drawing the maps has got all the power.
Okay, but again, Sylvia made a great point. Hispanics are everywhere. So the Department of Public Safety, when you walk in with your driver's license, you can register online. And don't tell me that somehow a clerk at the Department of Public Safety is anti-Hispanic and is not going to register someone. This idea that there's some systemic registration issue or racism issue with Harris County, whoever's in charge of it, is just flat wrong, because DPS is the front end. They do over 60% of the registrations in the entire county.
I wanted to ask Robert Miller.
I've never been asked if I've registered to vote at a DPS office.
So,
they kind of figured since you're a public official.
No, because their job is to register you, and then the voter registration department sorts it out on the back end.
I want to ask Robert Miller.
Okay.
I want to ask Robert Miller, what is this all going to mean at the end of the day? Because seriously, you are an experienced observer. You have your finger close to the pulse of both parties. Where are we going to end up?
What it means at the end of the day is what is going to be the partisan differential in the legislature and our congressional delegation. Texas, going into this election, there were 23 Republicans, 9 Democrats. As the commissioner said, Texas got 4 new seats. Those are likely to split 2 and 2, so we'll end up with 25 Republicans, 11 Democrats in our congressional delegation. In the state house, we had 101 Republicans, now 102 Republicans. I think the Republicans will end up somewhere between 90 and 95 with the range. So you'll have 60 to 65 Democrats in the state house next time, 90 to 95 Republicans. In the state Senate, currently it's 19-12, R to D. There's only 1 seat that's in play. It's Senator Wendy Davis in Fort Worth. That's a marginally Republican seat. She's an incumbent. I see that race at 50-50.
I agree with Robert, 95 in the House and 19 and a half in the Senate, however way the race goes in Fort Worth.
Silvia, close us out in the last minute. Are Hispanics going to turn out for Barack Obama in Harris County?
Yes, they are.
You think so? And what numbers? What numbers do you think he needs?
Oh, I couldn't venture to say what numbers. I just know that they will. I think if you look at any of the polling data nationally, I haven't seen a local Texas poll or a Houston area poll. I don't suspect that anyone will poll Texas till about, after Labor Day perhaps, show that the president has over 60%, sometimes as high as 70% of the Latino voters who will plan to vote for him.
Texas stays Republican. Harris County votes for a Republican for president.
Robert?
I think you asked for winners and losers. The big loser could potentially be the Democrats if Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is declared unconstitutional.
There's our firm for the future, Miller, Garcia, and Bettencourt.
I like it.
And we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Click on the local program bar, red, white, and blue. Read about our guests. Watch the shows along with our follow-up discussion. And please stay tuned for Houston 8 at 8 with Ernie Manous for the 2012 presidential primary season review. And until next time, get informed and get active.